So Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning is one of the great books of our time. Typically, if a book has one passage, one idea with the power to change a person's life, that alone justifies reading it, rereading it, and finding room for it on one's shelves. This book has several such passages. It is first of all a book about survival. Like so many German and East European Jews who thought themselves secure in the 1930s, Frankl was cast into the Nazi network of concentration and extermination camps. Miraculously, he survived, in the biblical phrase, a brand plucked from the fire. But his account in this book is less about his travails, what he suffered and lost, than it is about the sources of his strength to survive. Several times in the course of the book, Frankl approvingly quotes the words of Nietzsche: "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." He describes poignantly those prisoners who gave up on life, who had lost all hope for a future, and were inevitably the first to die. They died less from lack of food or medicine than from lack of hope, lack of something to live for. By contrast, Frankl kept himself alive and kept hope alive by summoning up thoughts of his wife and the prospect of seeing her again, and by dreaming at one point of lecturing after the war about the psychological lessons to be learned from the Auschwitz experience. Clearly, many prisoners who desperately wanted to live did die, some from disease, some in crematoria. But Frankl's concern is less with the question of why most died than it is with the question of why anyone at all survived. Terrible as it was, his experience in Auschwitz reinforced what was already one of his key ideas. Life is not primarily a quest for pleasure, as Freud believed, or a quest for power, as Alfred Adler taught, but a quest for meaning. The greatest task for any person is to find meaning in his or her life. Frankl saw three possible sources for meaning: in work, doing something significant; in love, caring for another person; and in courage during difficult times. Suffering in and of itself is meaningless. We give our suffering meaning by the way in which we respond to it. At one point, Frankl writes that a person may remain brave, dignified, and unselfish, or in the bitter fight for self-preservation, he may forget his human dignity and become no more than an animal. He concedes that only a few prisoners of the Nazis were able to do the former, but even one such example is sufficient proof that man's inner strength may raise above his outward fate. Finally, Frankl's most enduring insight, one that I have called on often in my own life and in countless counseling situations: forces beyond your control can take away everything you possess except one thing: your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation. You cannot control what happens to you in life, but you can always control what you feel and do about what happens to you. There is a scene in Arthur Miller's play, Incident at Vicky, in which an upper middle class man appears before the Nazi authority that has occupied his town and shows his credentials, his university degrees, his letters of reference from prominent citizens, and so on. The Nazi asks him, "Is that everything you have?" The man nods. The Nazi throws it all in the wastebasket and tells him, "Good, now you have nothing." The man whose self-esteem had always depended on the respect of others is emotionally destroyed. Frankl would have argued that we are never left with nothing as long as we retain the freedom to choose how we will respond. My own congressional experience has shown me the truth of Frankl's insights. I have known successful businessmen who, upon retirement, lost all zest for life. Their work had given their lives meaning. Often it was the only thing that had given their lives meaning, and without it, they spent day after day sitting at home, depressed, with nothing to do. I have known people who rose to the challenge of enduring the most terrible afflictions and situations as long as they believed there was a point to their suffering. Whether it was a family milestone they wanted to live long enough to share, or the prospect of doctors finding a cure by studying their illness, having a why to live for enabled them to bear the how. And my own experience echoes Frankl's in another way, just as the ideas in my book, when bad things happen to good people, gain power and credibility because they were offered in the context of my struggle to understand the illness and death of our son. Frankl's doctrine of logotherapy, curing the soul by leading it to find meaning in life, gains credibility against the background of his anguish in Auschwitz. The last half of the book, without the first, would be far less effective. I find it significant that the foreword to the 1962 edition of Man's Search for Meaning was written by a prominent psychologist, Dr. Gordon Allport, and the foreword to this new edition is written by a clergyman. We have come to recognize that this is a profoundly religious book. It insists that life is meaningful and that we must learn to see life as meaningful despite our circumstances. It emphasizes that there is an ultimate purpose to life, and in its original version, before a postscript was added, it concluded with one of the most religious sentences written in the 20th century. We have come to know man as he really is. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema Yisrael on his lips. Harold S. Kushner. Harold S. Kushner is Rabbi Emeritus at Temple Israel in Natick, Massachusetts, and the author of several best-selling books, including When Bad Things Happen to Good People, Living a Life That Matters, and When All You've Ever Wanted Isn't Enough. So now there's a preface, the 1992 edition. This book has now lived to see nearly 100 printings in English, in addition to having been published in 21 other languages, and the English editions alone have sold more than 3 million copies. These are the dry facts, and they may well be the reason why reporters of American newspapers, and particularly of American TV stations, more often than not start their interviews after listing these facts by exclaiming, "Dr. Frankl, your book has become a true bestseller. How do you feel about such a success?" Whereupon I react by reporting that in the first place, I do not at all see in the bestseller status of my book an achievement and accomplishment on my part, but rather an expression of the misery of our time. If hundreds of thousands of people reach out for a book whose very title promises to deal with the question of a meaning to life, it must be a question that burns under their fingernails. To be sure, something else may have contributed to the impact of the book. Its second theoretical part, Logotherapy in a nutshell, boils down, as it were, to the lesson one may distill from the first part, the autobiographical account, experiences in a concentration camp, whereas part one serves as the existential validation of my theories. Thus, both parts mutually support their credibility. I had none of this in mind when I wrote this book in 1945, and I did so within 9 successive days and with the firm determination that the book should be published anonymously. In fact, the first printing of the original German version does not show my name on the cover, though at the last moment just before the book's initial publication, I did finally give in to my friends who had urged me to let it be published with my name, at least on the title page. At first, however, it had been written with the absolute conviction that, as an anonymous opus, it could never earn its author literary fame. I had wanted simply to convey to the reader by way of a concrete example that life holds a potential meaning under any conditions, even the most miserable ones. And I thought that if the point were demonstrated in a situation as extreme as that in a concentration camp, my book might gain a hearing. I therefore felt responsible for writing down what I had gone through, for I thought it might be helpful to people who are prone to despair. And so it is both strange and remarkable to me that among some dozens of books I have authored, precisely this one, which I had intended to be published anonymously, so that it could never build up any reputation on the part of the author, did become a success. Again and again I therefore admonish my students both in Europe and in America, don't aim at success. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you're going to miss it. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue, and it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. Happiness must happen, and the same holds for success. You have to let it happen by not caring about it. I want you to listen to what your conscience commands you to do, and go on and carry it out to the best of your knowledge. Then you will live to see that in the long run, I say, success will follow you precisely because you had forgotten to think of it. The reader may ask me why I did not try to escape what in store for me after Hitler had occupied Austria. Let me answer by recalling the following story. Shortly before the United States entered World War II, I received an invitation to come to the American consulate in Vienna to pick up my immigration visa. My old parents were overjoyed because they expected that I would soon be allowed to leave Austria. I suddenly hesitated, however. The question beset me, could I really afford to leave my parents alone to face their fate, to be sent sooner or later to a concentration camp, or even to a so-called extermination camp? Where did my responsibility lie? Should I foster my brainchild, logotherapy, by emigrating to fertile soil where I could write my books? Or should I concentrate on my duties as a real child, the child of my parents who had to do whatever he could to protect them? I pondered the problem this way and that, but could not arrive at a solution. This was the type of dilemma that made one wish for, a hint from heaven, as the phrase goes. It was then that I noticed a piece of marble lying on a table at home. When I asked my father about it, he explained that he found it on the site where the National Socialists had burned down the largest Viennese synagogue. He had taken the piece home because it was part of the tablets on which the Ten Commandments were inscribed. One gilded Hebrew letter was engraved on the piece. My father explained that this letter stood for one of the commandments. Eagerly I asked, "Which one is it?" He answered, "Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land." At that moment, I decided to stay with my father and mother upon the land and to let the American visa lapse. Viktor E. Frankl, Vienna, 1962. The reader may ask me why I did not try to escape what was in store for me after Hitler had occupied Austria. So that was his explanation for that. So Harold S. Kushner wrote the foreword. The preface is written by Frankl. And let's read the afterword. So the afterword. On January 27, 2006, the 61st anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz death camp, where 1.5 million people died, nations around the world observed the first International Holocaust Remembrance Day. A few months later, they might well have celebrated the anniversary of one of the most abiding pieces of writing from that horrendous time. First published in German in 1946 as a psychologist experiences a concentration camp and later called Say Yes to Life in Spite of Everything. Subsequent editions were supplemented by an introduction to logotherapy and a postscript on tragic optimism, or how to remain optimistic in the face of pain, guilt, and death. The English translation, first published in 1959, was called Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl's book has now sold more than 12 million copies in a total of 24 languages. A 1991 Library of Congress Book of the Month Club survey asking readers to name a book that made a difference in your life found Man's Search for Meaning among the 10 most influential books in America. It had inspired religious and philosophical thinkers, mental health professionals, teachers, students, and general readers from all walks of life. It is routinely assigned to college, graduate, and high school students in psychology, philosophy, history, literature, Holocaust studies, religion, and theology. What accounts for its pervasive influence and enduring value? Viktor Frankl's life spanned nearly all of the 20th century, from his birth in 1905 to his death in 1997. At the age of 3, he decided to become a physician. In his autobiographical reflections, he recalls that as a youth, he would think for some minutes about the meaning of life, particularly about the meaning of the coming day and its meaning for me. As a teenager, Frankl was fascinated by philosophy, experimental psychology, and psychoanalysis. To supplement his high school classes, he attended adult education classes and began a correspondence with Sigmund Freud that led Freud to submit a manuscript of Frankl's to the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. The article was accepted and later published. That same year, at age 16, Frankl attended an adult education workshop on philosophy. The instructor, recognizing Frankl's precocious intellect, invited him to give a lecture on the meaning of life. So the article was accepted and later published that same year. At age 16, Frankl attended an adult education workshop on philosophy. The instructor, recognizing Frankl's precocious intellect, invited him to give a lecture on the meaning of life. Frankl told the audience that it is we ourselves who must answer the questions that life asks of us, and to these questions we can respond only by being responsible for our existence. This belief became the cornerstone of Frankl's personal life and professional identity. Under the influence of Freud's ideas, Frankl decided while he was still in high school to become a psychiatrist. Inspired in part by a fellow student who told him he had a gift for helping others, Frankl had begun to realize that he had a talent not only for diagnosing psychological problems, but also for discovering what motivates people. Frankl's first counseling job was entirely his own. He founded Vienna's first private youth counseling program and worked with troubled youths. From 1930 to 1937, he worked as a psychiatrist at the University Clinic in Vienna, caring for suicidal patients. He sought to help his patients find a way to make their lives meaningful even in the face of depression or mental illness. By 1939, he was head of the Department of Neurology at Rothschild Hospital, the only Jewish hospital in Vienna. Rothschild. In the early years of the war, Frankl's work at Rothschild gave him and his family some degree of protection from the threat of deportation. When the hospital was closed down by the National Socialist government, however, Frankl realized that they were at a grave risk of being sent to a concentration camp. In 1942, the American consul in Vienna informed him that he was eligible for a U.S. immigration visa. Although an escape from Austria would have enabled him to complete his book on logotherapy, he decided to let his visa lapse. He felt he should stay in Vienna for the sake of his aging parents. In September 1942, Frankl and his family were arrested and deported. Frankl spent the next 3 years at 4 different concentration camps: Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Kaufering, and Turkenheim, part of the Dachau complex. It is important to note that Frankl's imprisonment was not the only impetus for man's search for meaning. Before his deportation, he had already begun to formulate an argument that the quest for meaning is the key to mental health and human flourishing. As a prisoner, he was suddenly forced to assess whether his own life still had any meaning. His survival was a combined result of his will to live, his instinct for self-preservation, some generous acts of human decency, and shrewdness. Of course, it also depended on blind luck, such as where he happened to be in prison, the whims of the guards, and arbitrary decisions about where to line up and who to trust or believe. However, something more was needed to overcome the deprivations and degradations of the camps. Frankl drew constantly upon uniquely human capacities such as inborn optimism, humor, psychological detachment, brief moments of solitude, inner freedom, and a steely resolve not to give up or commit suicide. Steely. He realized that he must try to live for the future, and he drew strength from loving thoughts of his wife and his deep desire to finish his book on logotherapy. He also found meaning in glimpses of beauty in nature and art. Most important, he realized that no matter what happened, he retained the freedom to choose how to respond to his suffering. He saw this not merely as an option, but as his and every person's responsibility to choose the way in which he bears his burden. Sometimes Frankl's ideas are inspirational, as when he explains how dying patients and quadriplegics come to terms with their fate. Others are aspirational, as when he asserts that a person finds meaning by striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task. He shows how existential frustration provoked and motivated an unhappy diplomat to seek a new, more satisfying career. Frankl also uses moral exhortation, however, to call attention to the gap between what one is and what one should become, and the idea that man is responsible and must actualize the potential meaning of his life. He sees freedom and responsibility as two sides of the same coin. When he spoke to American audiences, Frankl was fond of saying, "I recommend that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast." To achieve personal meaning, he says, one must transcend subjective pleasures by doing something that points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself, by giving himself to a cause to serve or another person to love. Frankl himself chose to focus on his parents by staying in Vienna when he could have had safe passage to America. While he was in the same concentration camp as his father, Frankl managed to obtain morphine to ease his father's pain and stayed by his side during his dying days. Even when confronted by loss and sadness, Frankl's optimism, his constant affirmation of and exuberance about life led him to insist that hope and positive energy can turn challenges into triumphs. In man's search for meaning, he hastens to add that suffering is not necessary to find meaning, only that meaning is possible in spite of suffering. Indeed, he goes on to say that to suffer unnecessarily is masochistic rather than heroic. I first read Man's Search for Meaning as a philosophy professor in the mid-1960s. The book brought to my attention by a Norwegian philosopher who had himself been incarcerated in a Nazi concentration camp. My colleague remarked how strongly he agreed with Frankl about the importance of nourishing one's inner freedom, embracing the value of beauty in nature, art, poetry, literature, and feeling love for family and friends. But other personal choices, activities, relationships, hobbies, and even simple pleasures can also give meaning to life. Why then do some people find themselves feeling so empty? Frankl's wisdom here is worth emphasizing. It is a question of the attitude one takes toward life's challenges and opportunities, both large and small. A positive attitude enables a person to endure suffering and disappointment as well as enhance enjoyment and satisfaction. A negative attitude intensifies pain and deepens disappointments. It undermines and diminishes pleasure, happiness, and satisfaction. It may even lead to depression or physical illness. My friend and former colleague Norman Cousins was a tireless advocate for the value of positive emotions in promoting health, and he warned of the danger that negative emotions may jeopardize it. Although some critics attack Cousins' views as simplistic, subsequent research in psychoneuroimmunology has supported the ways in which positive emotions, expectations, and attitudes enhance our immune system. This research also reinforces Frankl's belief that one's approach to everything from life-threatening challenges to everyday situations helps to shape the meaning of our lives, their approach to it. The simple truth that Frankl so ardently promoted has profound significance for anyone who listens. The choices humans make should be active rather than passive. In making personal choices, we affirm our autonomy. A human being is not one thing among others. Things determine each other, Frankl writes, but man is ultimately self-determining. What he becomes within the limits of endowment and environment he has made out of himself. For example, the darkness of despair threatened to overwhelm a young Israeli soldier who had lost both his legs in the Yom Kippur War. He was drowning in depression and contemplating suicide. One day a friend noticed that his outlook had changed to hopeful serenity. The soldier attributed his transformation to reading Man's Search for Meaning. When he was told about the soldier, Frankl wondered whether there may be such a thing as autobibliotherapy, healing through reading. Frankl's comment hints at the reasons why man's search for meaning has such a powerful impact on many readers. Persons facing existential challenges or crisis may seek advice or guidance from family, friends, therapists, or religious counselors. Sometimes such advice is helpful, sometimes it is not. Persons facing difficult choices may not fully appreciate how much their own attitude interferes with the decision they need to make or the action they need to take. Frankl offers readers who are searching for answers to life's dilemmas a critical mandate. He does not tell people what to do, but why they must do it. After his liberation in 1945 from the Turkheim camp where he had nearly died of typhus, Frankl discovered that he was utterly alone. On the first day of his return to Vienna in August 1945, Frankl learned that his pregnant wife, Tilly, had died of sickness or starvation in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Sadly, his parents and brother had all died in the camps. Overcoming his losses and inevitable depression, he remained in Vienna to resume his career as a psychiatrist, an unusual choice when so many others, especially Jewish psychoanalysts and psychiatrists, had immigrated to other countries. I'm getting disrupted and I can't finish reading this. Anyway, peace. Alright guys, we're going to finish the last part of the Afterword. They're discussing, the person who wrote the Afterword is discussing why Viktor Frankl decided to stay in Vienna after being freed from the concentration camp. So several factors may have contributed to this decision. Frankl felt an intense connection to Vienna, especially to psychiatric patients who needed his help in the post-war period. He also believed strongly in reconciliation rather than revenge. He once remarked, "I do not forget any good deed done to me, and I do not carry a grudge for a bad one." Notably, he renounced the idea of collective guilt. Frankl was able to accept that his Viennese colleagues and neighbors may have known about or even participated in his persecution, and he did not condemn them for failing to join the resistance or die heroic deaths. Instead, he was deeply committed to the idea that even a vile Nazi criminal or a seemingly hopeless madman has the potential to transcend evil or insanity by making responsible choices. So instead, he was deeply committed to the idea that even a vile Nazi criminal or a seemingly hopeless man has the potential to transcend evil or insanity by making responsible choices. He threw himself passionately into his work. In 1946, he reconstructed and revised the book that was destroyed when he was first deported, The Doctor and the Soul. In that same year, in only 9 days, he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He hoped to cure through his writings the personal alienation and cultural malaise that plagued many individuals who felt an inner emptiness or a void within themselves. Perhaps this flurry of professional activity helped Frankl to restore meaning to his own life. 2 years later, he married Eleanor Schwint, who, like his first wife, was a nurse. Unlike Tilly, who was Jewish, Allie was Catholic. Although this may have been mere coincidence, it was characteristic of Viktor Frankl to accept individuals regardless of their religious beliefs or secular convictions. His deep commitment to the uniqueness and dignity of each individual was illustrated by his admiration for Freud and Adler, even though he disagreed with their philosophical and psychological theories. He also valued his personal relationships with philosophers as radically different as Martin Heidegger, a reformed Nazi sympathizer, Karl Jaspers, an advocate of collective guilt, and Gabriel Marcel, a Catholic philosopher and writer. As a psychiatrist, Frankl avoided direct reference to his personal religious beliefs. He was fond of saying that the aim of psychiatry was the healing of the soul, leaving to religion the salvation of the soul. He remained head of the neurology department at the Vienna Polyclinic Hospital for 25 years and wrote more than 30 books for both professionals and general readers. He lectured widely in Europe, the Americas, Australia, Asia, and Africa, held professorships at Harvard, Stanford, and the University of Pittsburgh, and was distinguished professor of logotherapy at the U.S. International University in San Diego. He met with politicians, world leaders such as Pope Paul VI, philosophers, students, teachers, and numerous individuals who had read and been inspired by his books. Even in his 90s, Frankl continued to engage in dialogue with visitors from all over the world and to respond personally to some of the hundreds of letters he received every week. 29 universities awarded him honorary degrees, and the American Psychiatric Association honored him with the Oscar Pfister Award. Frankl is credited with establishing logotherapy as a psychiatric technique that uses existential analysis to help patients resolve their emotional conflicts. He stimulated many therapists to look beyond patients' past or present problems to help them choose productive futures by making personal choices and taking responsibility for them. Several generations of therapists were inspired by his humanistic insights, which gained influence as a result of Frankl's prolific writing, provocative lectures, and engaging personality. He encouraged others to use existential analysis creatively rather than to establish an official doctrine. He argued that therapists should focus on the specific needs of individuals, patients. He argued that therapists should focus on the specific needs of individual patients rather than extrapolate from abstract theories. Despite a demanding schedule, Frankl also found time to take flying lessons and pursue his lifelong passion for mountain climbing. He joked that in contrast to Freud's and Adler's depth psychology, which emphasizes delving into an individual's past and his or her unconscious instincts and desires, he practiced height psychology, which focuses on a person's future and his or her conscious decisions and actions. His approach to psychotherapy stressed the importance of helping people to reach new heights of personal meaning through self-transcendence, the application of positive effort, technique, acceptance of limitations, and wise decisions. His goal was to provoke people into realizing that they could and should exercise their capacity for choice to achieve their own goals, writing about tragic optimism. He cautioned us that the world is in a bad state, but everything will become still worse unless each of us does his best. Frankl was once asked to express in one sentence the meaning of his own life. He wrote the response on paper and asked his students to guess what he had written. After some moments of quiet reflection, a student surprised Frankl by saying, "The meaning of your life is to help others find the meaning of theirs." "That was it, exactly," Frankl said. "Those are the very words I had written." Foreword, Afterword, written by William J. Winslade. William J. Winslade is a philosopher, lawyer, and psychoanalyst who teaches psychiatry, medical ethics, and medical jurisprudence at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston and the University of Houston Law Center. And here we are. Thanks for reading. Peace.